Hello, Zach. It's nice to see you again. We're back at it again with a pseudo episode of The Bridge. I think we'll consider this a main episode. No reason to really consider it a bonus episode, but we're doing another omnibus today. We're talking about four different albums that have kind of come under the radar for us over the last few months that we haven't really found time to talk about. Um, we're going to be covering Dinosaur Jr. And their new release, um, Lana Del Rey, Chemtrails Over the Country House. What is it?
Country Club.
Country Club. Um, Spirit of the Beehive and Igloo Ghost. So those are some of the albums that we've been meaning to talk about recently, and either because they didn't prompt a full review or we just didn't find time for them, that we decided to put them together into this one episode. Before we get going, is your weather as nice as our weather has been?
The weather actually for this time of year is still a little bit cold in Germany. It's nice out, but usually, it usually starts being 20 degrees here
Right.
in May.
We're ahead of the
But
game here in Newfoundland. Like, it's been way warmer than usual. Sun's been out. We had a lot of rain last month, but it all seems to have only just led to less snow and more green here now in May. It's nice to see. If you remember, usually we're still in the middle of our pretend spring at this point. Um,
yeah, we have to get past the May 24th weekend.
right,
Don't
right.
ever forget.
Yeah, we haven't got to that point, but I feel pretty confident that we're not gonna hit any snow soon. We've been getting too much good weather and good temperatures. Been in the kind of the 10 range, you know, not super warm, but good for us, especially this time of year. So that's been keeping my mood up.
How about the wind?
It's been windy. It's definitely been
Yeah,
windy.
I don't miss the wind at all.
Yeah, it's pretty gusty, keeping you on your toes. But weather-wise, sun-wise, it's been all right. Uh, so let's kind of start with Dinosaur Jr. I think today, because this is what we were going to talk about this week in full, um, and you've kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit before we started that you didn't like the album, and I think I know why. I think I know why you don't like the album, um, but I'm curious to hear it from your own words, like where you kind of how this album took you this over this last week.
I mean, it's very hard to distinguish one track from another. And I realize that these guys are a guitar oriented indie band, but the drum lines are practically the same in every single song, man. It's just so boring and repetitive.
Yeah, uh, it didn't reinvent the wheel. Going into this album, it is what it is. It's very true to what Dinosaur Jr. has been for a long time. They have this very guitar focused um, instrumentation with a little bit of the hidden bass and the hidden drums, and a lot of like solos here and there, flourishes, and then you have the vocal work on top. With lyrics that are kind of like whatever, kind of fluffy, whatever. There's a lot of vocal melodies and stuff that kind of carries the album. Um, but I agree with you in terms of like there's a little sameness to a lot of it, and a lot of a lack of like experimentation upon the album. And I did
Yeah.
kind of wrestle with that during the week.
It was so hard to listen to, and I just kept asking myself why? Why release this batch of songs? They are just so ordinary. And even the solos, they're sort of short, and there's maybe one or two that are caught my attention, but a lot of them, stop before they really get going. And, it just seems to me like if the band keeps on putting out music like this, they're only going to hurt the legacy that they established for themselves when they were sort of like the indie noise rock group in the early 80s. And then there's that one record they released in 94, I think.
Right, right.
Yeah, Without a Sound. And the songwriting on that record was really good, and they wrote some really nice songs. And I think the band was more of was like a one man act at that point.
Yeah, I think the band had
So,
kind of gone in weird directions and have come back for another round here now in the aughts, but and really have kind of existed now longer in this reunion than they did the previous iterations of the band, which is kind of interesting.
which is interesting, yeah, because when you think of Dinosaur Jr., you think of like noise rock indie band with really guitar oriented uh, guitar solos, that sort of thing, and you could see how bands like King Gizzard would be influenced by them. But this latest iteration of the band is just uh, I don't know why they're making these putting out this music. It feels so uninspired.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you, and I did wrestle with this a little bit, and I came to the kind of a conclusion where I kind of became more content with it. Um, the I kind of viewed it as a little bit of a '90s indie throwback, right? And I kind of thought about how much music I listen to uh, that's new that sounds like this anymore, and I kind of grew a little bit more in favor of it, just because I feel like I said, it doesn't reinvent the wheel in any sense of the way. It's pretty samey in certain ways, but there are definitely songs that like change the flow of things and bring in more jangly guitars, um, and like even the vocal melodies become a little more intricate. And the songwriting's not that bad. There's like some pretty good tunes here, some some little head bobbers and stuff. It's very rock right now.
It struck me almost as being like dad rock.
It does sound very dad rock. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
It does sound like something that will comfortably fit on your classic hits rock station wherever you are. Uh, it feels right at home in there. Like,
Hmm.
but there are some songs here I enjoyed, and that really brought more energy. Ensei, Take It Back, come out, Hide Another Round. Garden was like a slow burner that really appealed to me. Uh, I Met the
Yeah.
Stones was a good starter. One of the first two opening tracks. But you're right. It didn't. Even though there is versatility here on the album, and there are different kinds of licks and vocal melodies that are brought into the fold, it really doesn't go too far off the path at all. It is what it is. This is the '90s sounding Dinosaur Jr. is what we're getting here, and it is really throwback. It is very comfort in their like comfort spot, and the kind of building from there. And it is what it is. I could see why you wouldn't like it, and I kind of wrestled with the same ideas. Like it is just kind of the same old thing that I think you would expect of Dinosaur Jr. But at this point in your legacy, I'm curious, like, do you kind of just release music that sounds like music that you would release, or do you really like go off the wall and change yourself as you did from the '80s to the '90s? And I don't know. I think maybe I expect maybe that it's fine at this point in their career, and they're in their 50s. That these are decent songs. These are good songs. They're fairly well written, but they're a bit too comfort, a bit too in the pocket, and really as you would expect. But I did enjoy um, hearing this kind of music in 2021. Not you don't hear a lot of rock music anymore, and so to hear an
Hmm.
album that is rock music, it did kind of flavor me better. While not new for them per se, it felt new for the time, and so I kind of gave it a little more uh, leeway in that respect.
Yeah, you want to know the feeling that it gave me? It reminded me of when we listened to that Cloud Nothings record.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
You
I had
know,
similar thoughts.
yeah. It's just especially the repetitive drum lines. It's just I don't know why they want to keep on manufacturing. It almost sounds like they just manufactured a sound and then made 12 songs out of it,
Right, it
you
gets a
know?
bit much. Um, it was nice to kind of like hear in some respects, but it doesn't have staying power. It doesn't uh, incite like re-listens or go back to as much as you would some of the early releases, which Without a Sound is one of those. And I believe another one that I was a big fan of was one of their, I think their second album release, You're Living All Over Me, which is more in that noise pop pocket, that kind of like the forerunners before My Bloody Valentine released their album that blew up in the early '90s there. And they're kind of in that range, in that pocket, in that scene, and then they kind of cleaned out themselves a bit. Became a little indie alt rock in the '90s with the album that you mentioned earlier, and the songwriting is good, and you're kind of more compelled to go back and listen to those albums um, than you would be to start here. I think. Um,
Yeah, well, because those albums have character, and the band was onto something, and they played with more ambition and passion.
right.
Whereas here, like, it's just I just don't know why. Why bother?
Uh, I was thinking about his voice when listening to this. He still sounds the exact same.
He
He's
does, yeah.
he's like 55 or something, and he still sounds 20. If you just purely listen to this album without looking what this guy looks like right now, you'd picture like a 20-year-old. And I was really fascinated by the fact that his voice really doesn't sound like it changed at all.
Yeah, his voice really holds up. I'm not huge on his voice. Not to say that it's bad, just doesn't catch with me. There's like something twangy about it, or
Right, right. And it does feel more rock and old school rock, like you said, than I feel like it ever
Mhm.
felt before. In the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
90s, it felt very unique and kind of in its own rhythm and in its own lane. Um, but since then, it does feel dated. Uh, and I guess that's too, I don't know. Like, do I want Dinosaur Jr. to reinvent themselves at this point in their career? I don't know. I don't know what you'd really expect out of them at this point. It feels like their best days are behind them, and this album feels like they haven't like regressed per se. I still think they're pretty talented in doing what they do, and I don't honestly feel like this album is such a long stretch from their '90s work. Honestly, this album feels like it could have came out in '98 or something after Without a Sound. Uh, it just I don't know if that's to its detriment or it's to its appeal. It depends on who you are, I think. Um, in some ways,
It's
I want something new, and in some ways, I enjoy the comfort of returning to a sound that is familiar.
yeah. I find it bothersome when a band continues to put out music after they've sort of had their run, and you can tell the creativity just isn't there anymore.
Hmm.
And it seems like if you continue to put out albums of this caliber, it's only going to hurt your legacy.
Yeah, it does feel like maybe they've stagnated to a degree.
Hmm.
I was leaning going into this with like a six, is where I was leaning. Um,
For me, it's a four.
I was a four. Yeah. I was more acceptant of the sound that they were going with. I think
Hmm.
that than you were, but I can't give it too low. It's like it's a fine record. I wasn't as insulted by this as I was the Cloud Nothings record, which felt like a complete change of pace and gentrification of their sound.
Hmm.
Whereas this just feels uninspired but fine and well executed, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's just so painfully average for me and especially where the band is, they're sort of a legendary band. They're really one of the more popular noise rock bands that have come out of the 80s.
Right.
And now they're putting out this type of music. Like when you compare this album to their previous albums,
Yeah.
it makes it that much worse for me.
Right. I'm trying not to compare them to the '80s because it's completely a different band than you've seen with "You're Living All Over Me," for example, which is an album I really enjoyed that they released in '87. But I'm trying to more compare it to their '94 album "Without a Sound," um, which is this is more related to, I would think, in terms of soundscape. They had already changed from the 80s into the 90s, um, so I guess there's no reason why they wouldn't shouldn't have been able to change from the 90s into the aughts and the aughts into the 20s here. Um, but they didn't. They kind of like they probably got their biggest success with Without a Sound. You know, the very popular song "Feel the Pain" is on that album. So I guess once you find your popular pocket, you don't really need to switch it up too much. But it would have been nice to hear some more inspired tracks on this album.
Yeah, and I mean, also the band evolved their sound. Obviously, there was band politics that took a role in how that sound evolved, but still they weren't stagnant. Whereas now they're so stagnant, it just sounds so stale.
Hmm. I can see that.
And what really killed me on the whole album were the drum lines. Like the guitar was enough to keep me interested, but the drum lines were just so like meat and potatoes, boring.
Yeah, they're very meat and potatoes. And honestly, I struggle with the guitar because I relate to you that I think the guitar is the most overrated instrument. Um, and I probably said that on one of these episodes. So going into this and listening to an album that is very guitar centric, all its flavor kind of comes from the guitar playing and the different passages. I had to kind
Hmm.
of like reset my brain a bit and kind of go to this mush brain place where that guitar like was more appealing to me because generally speaking, I like a little more varied guitar or more varied instrumental palette, um, or something a little more.
Well, that Igloo Ghost record will really bring out,
Yes,
really highlight that.
right, right, absolutely, and we'll get to that one. Um, but you're right. I was like trying to listen to the drums on this album at some points. It's like, okay, so let's focus in on the drums at this point, and like nothing jumped into me. There was no like crazy fills or anything like too extravagant or anything that like was doing anything
It,
more than just keeping the beat.
that's all it does. It just holds the beat.
It's not like crazy technical album. It just kind of feels a little rocky, and kind of what leads to why we're doing Omnibus is like that's kind of all there is to say about the album. And I think
And
we covered that in like 15 minutes.
yeah, and we were gonna cover another record too by Death from Above, their latest release, and it's a little bit of this of a similar story, where the band released a really great record with their debut release, and it just seems like nothing they release afterwards is gonna live up to that record,
Right.
and they at least they try to do a little something different with the sound, but they don't stray too far from it, and they just end up like throwing a bunch of distortion all over the vocals and the guitar, and it sounds really almost confused. Like the band didn't know how to evolve the sound, so they just you know oversaturated it with distortion.
Right, right. I gave it a light listen. I don't quite really remember all that much about it. I was never a huge fan of the band in general, so I found it a little more difficult to get into. Um, I do kind of enjoy that like punk, pop, dancey flavor that they have. I didn't think they did a terrible job with their last album. Uh, Outrage, I think, is the album before this one. I did enjoy. I thought that was kind of like that. I thought felt like that album was them coming into their own into this new era of the band. And I am curious to go back and listen to this version of it and give it a little more of a listen and kind of pull it apart a little bit. But hopefully it isn't that like too bad. I just it's always been a band I've struggled with Death from Above, so it was difficult for me
Yeah.
to pull together that week.
Yeah, well, I mean, like in comparison to Dinosaur Jr., I like their poppy, dancey approach to rock music,
Hmm.
and it makes it feel young. It just gives it life, but they just I don't know, the album seemed like it's a little bit stuck, and their way of sort of making that record seem different from anything they've done in the past is just oversaturated with all kinds of distortion. And it was kind of underwhelming. Not necessarily a bad record, but it was just yeah underwhelming.
Yeah, okay. Did you you also listen to Lana Del Rey, which is an album I've been meaning to listen to, but I didn't get around to. I heard one track from it. I can't quite remember what it is off the top of my head at the moment. I'll pull that up. That I did enjoy.
Yeah, and you know she's coming off I think the most popular record of her career with Norman fucking Reedus. So there was a lot of expectations, perhaps unfair expectations, and hype going into this record, and some people felt a little bit underwhelmed with the sound on this one, just because there's not like a hit or anything per se. She keeps it pretty like her music is very much this achingly nostalgic indie rock.
Right. The track, by the way, was "White Dresses," is the one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, it's the opener to the record.
Okay, okay. And I have to admit, I've never really listened to a Lana Del Rey record before. I don't really know anything about her.
I mean, you've probably heard the remix to the song "Summertime Sadness."
Oh yes, I think I'd have.
If you've been in a club anywhere in the past 5 years, you've probably heard that song.
Well, not quite a place I've been. I do think I've heard it on the radio.
Yeah, there's just no escaping the song. It's
Yeah, okay.
anyways.
That is the song I'm familiar. So this new record by her, they just kind of a lukewarm reception, I guess.
Well, no, I think she's sort of like you know, she's her own woman, obviously, but she's sort of been presented to the world as like the new Stevie Nicks. And in fact, Stevie Nicks featured on Norman fucking Reedus. And
Is that the
listen,
name
this
of
is
the
a
album?
yeah, that's the name of the album is Norman fucking Reedus.
Okay, not the person.
No. Anyways, this album, Chemtrails Over the Country Club, more or less a meditation on, I think, her early years when she was waitressing, trying to break into the music scene.
Yeah, that's basically what the entirety of like the first song, "White Dresses," is about. Which I really
Yeah,
enjoyed that song. Like of the song I heard, I was really impressed with "White Dresses." I thought it was very tuneful and melancholy and really nostalgic and stuff, and I enjoyed it. Like it was a nice voice that she has. It's very folky and wispy, and but like she kind of goes within several ranges within her voice, and she definitely has like a very interesting and well control over her voice. Just basing off of the one song I heard.
yeah,
I was
yeah.
super interested in hearing the rest of the album. I don't know if it is kind of all within that realm or if it goes up or down from there.
Well, that's the thing that it sort of come under criticism a bit for is that it doesn't, yeah, go beyond that realm very much, except for one song, um, "Dance Till We Die," and like you were saying, she has a pretty wide vocal range, but the vocal style doesn't change from what you hear on White Dress very much throughout the album. But Dance Till We Die, she sort of becomes a little. She sort of lets her hair down a little bit, and her singing style becomes a little more relaxed, and and for that reason, the mood of the track is just a little bit more fun on an album that is a little too melancholic, a little too serious at times. She's also been congratulated or she's been praised for her songwriting.
Yeah,
And
the White Dresses felt like a very well written song. It kind of reminded me, and this may either be an insult or a compliment depending on who you are. Kind of reminded me of some of that early Taylor Swift stuff when she was more
okay,
writing her own stuff, but just like
uh-huh.
without the country twang or anything to it, and that kind of like immaturity that comes a little bit along with Taylor Swift's like song topics. But you know, kind of like that white middle class girl, you know, with all these like you know that kind of perspective that came on things and the kind of romanticism of it all.
And she writes nice refrains, and usually the lyricism is good, but every now and again she'll have a line like she has in this track, White Dresses. Look how I got this, just singing in the street. Down at the men, down at the men in music business conference. It's hard enough to say that, let alone sing it in a melodious way. And sometimes the lyrics can be clunky, and that this track is a good example. But I've heard people singing praises about this song and the songwriting, and it is good, but except for this one moment, it's so awkward, and I no matter how many times I listen to the song, it always sticks out. And there's a couple other instances on the record where there are these clunky lyrics, and so yeah, the lyrics are for the most part really good, but there are some weird, awkward moments, like down at the Men in Music Business Conference, and even when she sings it, like she sort of like accelerates her voice
You know what it kind of
to
sounds like? It sounds like you ever just like let your phone autocorrect? Just
yeah.
it just hit the hit middle button, see what kind of sentence it makes. It kind of sounds like one of those.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So
Yeah, but
would you generally recommend the album for a listen, or do you think it's not one of her better works? Like, I'm not sure exactly where there's some criticism you have here, but as an overall
yeah,
piece,
yeah, I think it's a solid 7 record, and you should definitely check it out if you like indie rock, or if you like sort of this achingly beautiful voice and slower songs. It's mostly balladry that you'll hear on the album.
hmm
Something that's yeah nice to play in the evenings, or if you're with your girlfriend or boyfriend,
right, right, okay,
definitely put it on. And apparently, she announced that she's releasing another record later on this year or during the summer, I think.
oh geez,
So who knows? Maybe we'll get around to actually giving that album the full treatment.
right, right. I wouldn't mind giving Lana a full treatment because I am kind of ignorant about her. I would like to increase my my knowledge of the landscape because she's pretty popular from what I understand.
Yeah, she's probably like the queen of indie rock right now.
Okay, okay. Um, Another album I was kind of trying to talk about for a few weeks um, is a album by Igloo Ghost, Leyline Eon, which is his second album release. He is like a kind of a glitch pop, drum and bass, drill and bass, synthetic electronic album with a lot of dense soundscapes and textures that uh, go up and down. A lot of like violin usages and like very harmonious sections, and it's a really interesting blend of organic sounds and electronic glitchy sounds, and it's a prominently instrumental album. There are vocal passages that are like voice pitched or kind of put in there in janky ways that I don't really think uh, emphasize uh, the sound as much. It just kind of feels like more layers on to the sounds that come out of this album.
Hmm.
I became familiar with Igloo Ghost when he released his sister EPs a few years ago. Okay, yeah, back in 2018 is what I'm talking about. Steel Mogu and Clear Tamat. I can't pronounce that. Clear Tamie. It's like these. He creates these like little characters that he kind of writes music around. They're like these little snow creatures with like little hats and mystical features to them. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Do you ever hear the game called Journey?
I've heard of it. I'm looking at the little characters right now.
Right, they kind of remind me of that character in that game. They're just kind of like
Okay.
little cutesy little things that kind of inhabit this world that he creates within his head, and then he kind of like writes the soundtrack to. Um, the music kind of gives me this feeling of like walking through a lush forest, and then and reaching down to smell a flower, only to see the serbos and glitchy features of it when you get close enough. You know, like everything has like this weird organic feel to it, but like it's made of all these electronic sounds that remind me of like a craft work in the way they're put together, and they also remind me of Aphex Twin as like another uh, popular drum and bass kind of artist that kind of has a similar sound. But it just really feels
Yeah.
unique. His sound feels really unique. It's really dense. There's a lot of like rise, peaks and valleys through it. It's just such a good background music that I think it's hard not to like. Honestly, there isn't quite the banger quality of Neon Wax Bloom, which was the first album that is critically acclaimed across the board. This one has takes a more smoother approach, a little more harmony, and a little more, you know, feel nice to it. Like, you know, everything feels like so pretty and but like chaotic at the same time. But also like a controlled chaos. Like everything has its place. Everything is put specifically where it needs to be put, but it has such a free flow to it at the same time.
So I checked out this record, and it seems to me like it's like an avant-garde dubstep record. Like he uses all those syncopated
Mm-hmm.
bass, yeah, and there's all these weird pitch sounds that are going on, like super high pitch, that I find to be very annoying. And I also didn't understand why you compared them to Kraftwerk, because Kraftwerk is a band that likes to establish a pattern, and it has this looping repetitiveness to their music, like the song Autobahn.
Um, Specifically, the Kraftwerk
This album
song.
doesn't. This album doesn't establish any sort of repetition or pattern. It's constantly sort of being very polyphonic and all over the place and at the same in the same place at the same time. And it was more like almost occupying a music installation. It was a lot of noise, and he was blending, like you said, the analog and the digital together. And I can certainly see how it appeals to some people, but not my thing.
Right, the song that I specifically have in mind when I type of Kraftwerk, and why that's familiar to me. I'm gonna have trouble pronouncing this, so you might have to help me here. Morgan Spazingang. Uh, it's the song where he creates this very organic soundscape, like a trickling river and tweeting birds, but there's all of these electronic features, and that kind of like mix of organic and electric that they use at the end of that album is kind of where I'm pulling that
Uh,
comparison.
yeah, I can see what you're saying with a track like that, which is not when I think of Kraftwerk, isn't that those are not the types of tracks that come to mind.
Sure.
But I can certainly see the comparison there, yeah, for sure. And that's what it's trying to do, is like create this sort of space of dusk or dawn.
Right, and that's probably my favorite Kraftwerk song. Only probably because I've only listened to that one album, Autobahn. But that's kind of the first thing that comes to my head when I think of Kraftwerk. Yeah, is
Hmm.
that song and how they were able to like create this landscape of sound, and I get that as well in this album. This was
Yeah,
like one of my favorite albums so far this year. I was really compelled by the soundscape. I could just like really just like zen out listening to this. There are like a lot of pitch, like a high pitch like electronic like peeps, um, but it's kind of like he kind of creates this kind of like world that exists where these little wiggly creatures and stuff, and that's always been kind of like the sound of those creatures, you know.
hmm
And so he creates this like world that kind of exists within the sounds he creates, and I've always pictured those kind of like high pitched kind of uh, sounds to be kind of like emphasizing or encompassing these little fairy creatures that he talks about and places on the front of his albums.
yeah. I could see that. It has a bit of a concept to it in that sense, I guess.
Right, and
Uh,
in terms, I'm not a huge electronic fan, but this has definitely been like a certain gate for me to kind of get into to the genre. This has like been a very good palette to start with, in my opinion. Because I'm not a huge Aphex Twin fan, because I think the drum bass is a bit too rapid and too monotonous in some of the respects. But there's all
The last record you put out is a lot like this one, though, isn't it?
I haven't. I've only really listened to the one Aphex Twin album, so my opinion is really skewed. Um, but from that experience there, but there's also been a lot of Aphex Twin stuff on that, even on that album, that I did enjoy. It's just kind of the pocket that he chooses to be in depends on my taste for it. But this has been a little more smoother, a little more brought back, less like dramatic in certain ways, but still like a very soundscapey, storyline driveny kind of electronic album that I think definitely people should check out. I thought it was phenomenal, and it's definitely one of my favorite albums of the year.
It makes me even more curious that you didn't care too much for the Spirit of the Beehive
Uh,
record.
I think that's a
Int-
misdemeanor. It's like I did like that album. I enjoyed it plenty actually. It even starts off with like this noise section that really grabbed my attention. But just I guess that week I just wasn't able to like conjure any compelling thoughts about it. You know, I enjoy what they were doing. It had this very like dim glow about it in the way it's produced and the production techniques, and it was very easy to listen to and engaging in a lot of ways. And it was kind of like this one holistic piece, but it kind of made me struggle a bit to like really come up with a content to talk about with the album, and that's kind of where I was. And I was a bit distracted that week as well. That might have also played into it. Returning to the album, probably I might be able to grab onto something a little more tangible with it.
yeah, well, the record is called Entertainment Death, and is similar to this last Igloo Ghost record. It very much creates a soundscape, and one of the criticisms against the album is that cool record, but the songs, there's not really, it's not really an album you can go and just put on a song and listen to it and be like, oh, that's a good song.
Right.
The album sort of works, everything it works together,
Mhm.
and you're very much sort of walking into sort of this weird, psychedelic, carnivalesque soundscape, and the band were sort of this shoegazy psychedelic act beforehand. However, this is the first record where they've been able to produce the record themselves,
Okay.
and so there has been a pretty steep progression in their sound, and they got very experimental with the production.
Right. I think they
And,
got pretty experimental with the song structure too. But I felt like it was weird. They would do these really hard cuts throughout the album, to the point where it became difficult upon just listening to when the hard cut initiated an end of a song and beginning of the next song, or it was just something in the middle of the song. I know Entertainment, for example, had like two. One was a little better done, but one of them was a blanket hard cut in Entertainment, from like the noise opening chaos into this more indie tronic second half. Um,
mhm.
and then I was kind of paying attention to that as I was going, and it's like by the time I got to the fourth track, I felt like I counted off like 8 or 9 hard cuts from like one genre of a song to another genre of a song, where the transition, it felt very like TV clicky, you know, like it would just change. And,
Hard cuts, yeah. Like
right,
the sort of big song on the record, the longest song on the record is called "I Suck the Devil's Cock," and it essentially summarizes everything that you're saying. Like they incorporate a number of different genres in that one song, and they sort of cycle through them with these hard cuts.
right, and it, because of these hard cuts, it actually made it feel like the album feel like a more um, cohesive single piece in a weird way, you know, because like I was no longer able to discern between tracks, because hard cuts would not signify the end of a track into another track. It just meant like a transition of sound. And so all these hard cuts that would happen between tracks, they were still there, and sometimes they weren't there. But like it made you a little more lost when you listen to it. It kind of removed it by adding an abundance of like fake outs. It made you like really get lost in the holistic sound of the album, and I kind of liked it. Like when I started thinking about what was happening and the fact that it kind of the hard cut usually it would be something I would complain about. But the fact that they do it kind of so often and it seems intentional, and the way that it kind of brings all the pieces together a little more in this little box, I kind of liked. But that was kind of most of like what I was able to like pull from it in terms of critical analysis. Besides,
Yeah,
because
well,
go ahead.
the other thing I would say is that the band really creates a great atmosphere, very hallucinogenic, hallucinatory atmosphere. However, they go too much into the atmosphere area and they it sort of took away a little bit from the songwriting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And they got so hung up on, or not hung up, but so invested in being able to create this cool atmosphere and this psychedelic atmosphere that they forgot a little bit to write more coherent songs.
Um,
And
yeah, I kind of ended up being very unable to kind of define how I felt about
mhm.
it, because in some aspects I really enjoyed how undefined some of the tracks were, and how it kind of fit in among the album. I was enjoying what they were doing a lot of the time and how it felt, but like it's really like hard to define this album in general because the genres switch so frequently and everything feels like an overall concept. Though, like I said, like this kind of like ADD nature and channel flicking nature of music now and how we digest it, and it felt like there was a larger critique going on and a larger structure going on that was compelling to me. But the fact that I couldn't really hook into and really write anything compelling besides this part of this song was this part of this song was that, I liked this about this, I didn't like that about that, and in a really more robotic kind of review structure is kind of what it brought out of me, because it was felt like a very robotic kind of album in some respects, in terms of like the kind of the way they structured certain things, but they put it in within this more organic and holistic piece. So it wasn't when I say robotic, it's not necessarily an insult to it or say it's boring of any sort. It just felt very mechanical in certain respects.
Yeah, yeah, I can see what you're saying about the mechanical song structure, especially like with the individual songs. Um, and then when you take the album as a whole, it can bleed together a bit. And I think that plays into what I was saying about it focusing so much on atmosphere. And the band gets away from trying to write a coherent song. But for that reason, because it's so atmospheric, I am able to draw some comparisons to this Igloo Ghost record because it seems like it's very much concerned with being atmospheric as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that Igloo Ghost record is perhaps more avant-garde versus the Spirit of the Beehive record, and I found the Spirit of the Beehive record to be more accessible just because it's a little more fun and there's a lot it's really busy, but the Igloo Ghost record to me there's just some sort of density to it,
Mm-hmm.
and the combination of the electronic and the digital and the analog, and I don't know if he samples field recordings, but it sounds like he samples field recordings sometimes. It just it was a little bit more heady compared
Yeah,
to the Spirit of the Beehive record.
I would say Igloo Ghost is more defined in terms of what is trying to be accomplished and the sounds that are being incorporated and the textures that are used. And in terms of like its accessibility, it really kind of depends on if that defined sound that is being offered up is really in your wheelhouse, I think. Whereas Entertainment Death, it does have this vibe of like urban, like street dwelling almost, It's an urban teenage livelihood or early 20s, you know, where Igloo Ghost is a more vague of a creature of an existence, and that's how I would find it. I find them both avant-garde in their own ways, but Igloo Ghost kind of goes off in a more futuristic kind of approach rather than Entertainment Death's more urban millennial approach, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, the guys are they're a younger band out of Philly. Um, but yeah, it's just I would say Spirit of the Beehive is a little more fun, whereas Igloo Ghost is it's more of a serious, really intellectual.
Yeah, it is. But it's also whimsical in a lot of ways, but it is very kind of serious in its structure. And
I like the vocal features that were on the album. It gave it a little bit more of a softer, whimsical
right, right.
feel on some of the songs.
I really
That
enjoyed "Baby." Was one her feature on there, and Lola as well was really great.
Yeah. So, do you have another album that you want to talk about?
I'm just checking to see if there's anything I really looked into. The only other albums I really listened to in between all this was kind of some older albums that really don't fit the discussion per se.
Mm-hmm.
I know I was talking to some people about the album and some of the episodes they were listening to. I know my friend Mark was talking to me about that Cloud Nothing's release, and we had a discussion about the difference between No Future, No Past and Oslo. Both 4-minute songs on two different albums, and like what is accomplished in one and what's accomplished in the other. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of delved into it a little bit more, and No Future, No Past is such a slower song, and like it has like this intensity that's just underneath the surface of the song that eventually comes out in the end in the breakdown and has a more emotional explosion to it. Whereas Oslo does a similar thing, but it kind of gives you more of a roller coaster where it does release and give more energy throughout the song. There's more expression earlier in the song, so that when the breakdown does happen later, it doesn't have such an overwhelming emphasis as Few No Future No Fast has, which built better into the breakdown. And that was something that we were discussing that I thought I was going to bring up here. And I was also in your Facebook talking to one of your friends. I forget his name now. Maybe I should look that up so I can
Danny. Oh,
reference it.
his name doesn't matter.
Okay, sure. And he was saying how he really enjoyed the features on Brockhampton, and and you kind of gave the features some shit. Uh, you did mostly shit on the JPEG
JPEG Mafia.
Mafia, but you did also stress several times in the episode how the features really took away from the album.
Well, they just don't fit the album. They're just like I said. They would have been made a good EP
Do you think?
and start the album with Light, but they just don't make any sense for the album. They seem like an appendage that is tacked on.
Right, so that was some of the comments that I seen about some of the episodes. I figured I'd relate to you, to see how you felt, if you felt like you needed to defend your point or anything on that.
No, I think yeah. What I say, what my listening of the record makes sense. And even if you like the features, I think it's not hard to understand where it is I'm coming from because there's such a coherence that comes after starting and after Light, which the other songs are don't relate to.
Right.
It doesn't fit the coherence of the rest of the album.
So I was thinking, in the future, when we come across an album that sometimes maybe we don't have a lot to talk about, that we embrace some more shorter episodes. Like today's episode is probably going to be a shorter one, around 40 something minutes. So I think maybe we can embrace a little bit of that more of a format in the future if it comes to an album that we don't have a lot to say about, and more short form reviews. I enjoy our longer reviews as well, because usually that means we have a lot to talk about. Um, like with the Brockhampton review went to an hour 20, and I didn't have any problem with that, just because I felt like there was a lot for us to talk about and to go over and to cover and discuss back and forth. And so some reviews don't really lend itself to that kind of conversation, and I think that's better covered in this kind of format. But it's kind of weird because sometimes we don't really realize that there's not a lot of content to cover for an hour long podcast until way late in the week, and then it's we kind of a little stuck a little bit. So that's kind of, I think, some of the genesis of some of these kind of episodes, and maybe we'll have to put some work into figuring out quite how to handle that situation a little better in the future.
Yeah, and there's also the beginning of April was a little bit stale, let's be honest, as far as music releases go.
Right.
Um, However, at the end of April, Gojira released a new record, and it's everyone's been singing its praises, and I've checked it out, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
All right.
And
That's interesting. Again, another step into my music discovery. I'm interested in giving another toe into the lake of metal and seeing how I come out on the other end. Maybe by the end, maybe in a few years' time, I'll be after doing this podcast for so long, I'll be wearing my Opeth t-shirts in my my studded chain chokers. So I'm looking forward to
yeah,
it.
no, yeah, I wouldn't characterize them as being like Opeth, but I think it is a far more accessible metal record for someone such as yourself who is a little bit weary of the genre. It's certainly not going to include any grindcore elements like the Pupil Slicer record.
Right, right.
So, yeah, I really threw you to the wolves with that one. I just tossed you right in.
Yeah, but that's fine. I did enjoy the album overall, but it's again, I kind of covered my opinions on it. So I'm interested to see how this one develops and what kind of pocket of metal that this brings forth. So
Yeah,
that's a confirmed for next week that we will be talking about Gojira.
yes, and for anybody who's wondering, that is Godzilla in Japanese,
Right.
and
I
the
thought so.
band are from France.
Sorry.
The band they come from France.
Oh, France. Okay. I thought you said Frost for a second. I was like, well, is
No.
that a gimmick of the ice zombies now? You got some Game of Thrones going.
I don't know. I haven't seen the latest Godzilla movie. It's not really my thing. But you're a Godzilla fan.
I'm a slight Godzilla fan. I just like some of the more. I like visiting it every now and then. I don't really like the American versions. Um, I'm more into some of the more either the cheesy Japanese versions or even like the one I did make you watch, Shin Godzilla, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and that movie was pretty decent. It had some good satire actually.
Right. Well,
But
Godzilla's never going to be. Well, the first one was kind of like peak cinema, but Godzilla was never really. It never really evolved into something that's a cinematic classic. It is a formula of sorts, and I thought that the formula was done really well in Shin Godzilla, and a new design and a lot of really great cinematography going on, and it was directed by the guy who did Neon Genesis Evangelion, and there's scenes in there that you really spit of it. But I think we're dragging out a little bit, and I think we'll be back next week to talk about some Gojira. By the way, like, subscribe, share, do all that. We have a donate feature now, which was shared with this post. Obviously not obligated to do anything like that. It's just there if you feel compelled to. Means I would appreciate it. And we'll see you next week.